And today we're here with lesson 4 from Get Caught Up for GCSE, lesson 4 on Macbeth, and we're going to look at King Duncan today and the idea of kingship. So kingship's a theme that runs through Macbeth. It's something that's really important in terms of ideas about who should be king, who decides who is king, and you should have an idea about how that works based on video lesson 1 that we looked at when we looked at context and the idea of who chose James I to be king after Queen Elizabeth died. And I want you to think about how that works and how kingship would be something that would interest people at the time. And we're going to look at that, and we're going to look at it in relation to the Great Chain of Being as well, which is also mentioned in video lesson 1. So if you haven't watched the first lesson yet about context, or you don't really know what some of these terms mean, maybe go back and have a look at that one first before we start looking at this one. So we're going to start off by looking at Duncan, because he's a big character in the play, even though, you know, spoiler alert, he does die in the next act, and then obviously doesn't reappear after that. And so although he doesn't appear a lot in the play, he is really significant because this is a play about becoming king. So Duncan, is he represented as being a good king? Well, when we meet him in Act 1 Scene 2, we get a sense of what sort of a king he is. Now, we looked at Act 1 Scene 2 in the last video lesson when we were looking at Macbeth, but today we're going to look at the way that actually Shakespeare does introduce Macbeth by having the captain tell us about him, but he also introduces Duncan. And being as Duncan doesn't get a lot of time before he dies in the play, it's a good way of us getting to know Duncan by seeing him on stage. So a few of these quotes are really useful, and as we talked about last time, if you've got your copy of Macbeth handy, which you should have while we're going through these things, make sure that you look for these quotes and you annotate them as we go, because these are all pretty good quotes when it comes to thinking about the ideas that we're going to look at in this video. And also they're really useful quotes when it comes to the end of the video, and I'll set you a few questions to answer. So just think about the way that these quotes work and have a go at annotating them as we go through. So the first one we're going to look at is for Act 1 Scene 2, and it's line 24 when Duncan says, "O valiant cousin, worthy gentleman," and he's speaking of Macbeth. Okay, and he also then references Ross as a worthy thane. And he talks to the captain and he says, thy words become thee as thy wounds. They smack of honour both. And then also the last line in that scene, which is, what he hath lost, noble Macbeth has won. When he's talking about the old Thane of Cawdor being executed and then him giving the title to Macbeth. Now, the important thing about this is that all these quotes help to show what sort of a king Duncan is. And he does what we would expect a good king to do at this time, which is he's kind, he's merciful, and he compliments his subjects in terms of the people beneath him on the Great Chain of Being. He does what he should do. He looks after them, so he treats them with respect. In this, he even promotes Macbeth, and that would be seen as you know, the sort of thing that you would expect a good king to do. He recognises loyalty and bravery on the battlefield, and he rewards those qualities, and he's thankful for the people that serve him loyally, and those sorts of things are what a good king should be and what people would expect from a good king. Also, there's an element of strength there as well, so this idea that Duncan doesn't show mercy to a traitor, has him sentenced to death in this scene. And because we need to remember that treachery isn't just a crime against the country, but it's also against nature, if you like, and against God. So if the king is killed by somebody and they're not supposed to be, then that breaks the Great Chain of Being and it causes chaos. So from this point of view, you know, an audience would expect to see that strength from him. Although he's a great king, they don't want to see him punish these people that deserve it, and traitors were the most severe of criminals, if you like, and they would expect that. So all those great things are there to be seen in Act 1 Scene 2. So Duncan established as a good king, yeah, Shakespeare definitely tries to show that. And in Act 1 Scene 4 we see his generosity. So the way that he speaks to his subjects and his soldiers and his relatives, if you like, his family, we have this wonderful, generous, warm nature to him. And when Macbeth appears and they meet, he says, "The sin of my ingratitude even now was heavy upon me." So there's kind of like this idea, and he goes on to say that even though he's made Macbeth Thane of Cawdor, it still can't be enough to reward him for the wonderful things that he's done for the king. So he is very gracious and very humble in that respect. And to Banquo, he says, "Let me enfold thee and hold thee to my heart." And that's quite important too, because there's this idea of closeness and what he's allowing people in. Now we'll look at this in a minute, but when he says this to Banquo, there is a little bit of foreshadowing there when he references his heart, because he's quite happy to allow Banquo into his heart. But what happens when he lets Macbeth into his heart? Well, he stabs him in it, essentially, and that's really important. So we've almost got a little bit of foreshadowing there in terms of the use of Duncan's heart to show his kind nature. He goes on to say, "We will establish our estate upon our eldest, Malcolm," when he makes him Prince of Cumberland, showing again that he rewards these that are closest to him. And this great quote where it says, "Signs of nobleness, like stars, I can't say it. Signs of nobleness, like stars, shall shine on all deservers." And that's really good. A really good quote for you to use, because it shows that he sees himself as someone who rewards those who deserve it, who are noblest. And he uses the stars and the shine, because the light and the dark in this play are really important, and the opposites of those. But also the stars represent those celestial bodies that have the power at the top of the great chain of being, or near the top of it. And interestingly enough, a few lines after this is when Macbeth he turns against Duncan and he tells the stars to hide their fires, because he doesn't want to be shone on, because he's thinking of dark things to do. So Duncan wants to shine a light on all those that deserve this nobleness, and Macbeth deliberately says, "Stars, hide your fires. I don't want you to see me, and I don't want you to shine on me, because I'm going to do bad things, and I don't want you to see it." So we've got a direct contrast between Duncan and between Macbeth here. All right, and Duncan is definitely the light and the goodness, and Macbeth is turning into the dark and the bad and the evil. All right, so that's really important as well that we think about that. Why is Duncan established as a good king? Why is it important he's established as a good king here? And that's a really important question. All right, and he is generous and kind, and he does all he should. But again, like we did yesterday with Macbeth, we talked about Macbeth being important and established as a hero. Why is it then significant that Duncan is established as a really good king? Well, I'll tell you. The reason is because if Duncan was a bad king, it could justify Macbeth killing him later on. It could be that Macbeth is supposed to kill him because he's a bad king. So it could be God intervening through Macbeth to remove a bad king on earth. But actually, Duncan's an incredible king. He's brilliant. So that's really important, so that there's no doubt in our mind that Macbeth does not have an excuse for killing Duncan. There is nothing but his own selfish greed that propels him to kill Duncan. All right, and that's really important, especially to an audience then, because an audience couldn't turn around and go, "Oh, well, maybe Macbeth was doing what God wanted because Duncan's not very good at being king, so we're getting him out of the way and then we're establishing the new king." No, we can't say that. Duncan's brilliant as a king, and that's why it's really significant that there's no argument there, and we can only see Macbeth as a villain here. Okay, so Duncan is generous, he's kind, but he's not perfect. And we know he's not perfect because he does say to us in this scene that he hasn't managed to work out that the Thane of Cawdor, the previous Thane of Cawdor, was a traitor. He says there's no art to find the mind's construction in the face. That means that there's no way of telling what someone's thinking by looking at their face. And he's establishing this idea of deception and the fact that the Thane of Cawdor deceived him and tried to overthrow him. And this was, as he says, look, in the next line, "He was a gentleman on whom I built an absolute trust." And that shows that he trusted the Thane of Cawdor wholly. completely, and he had it used against him when the Thane of Cawdor became a traitor. And we get this idea that maybe Duncan is not the finest judge of character, and he isn't very good at reading these people. Maybe he's too generous, maybe he's too kind, maybe he's too trusting. Because obviously at the end of this scene, he refers to Macbeth as my worthy Cawdor. And in doing so, unfortunately, already establishes to us that although he's just executed one Thane of Cawdor for treachery, he's just appointed another one, and we know already, dramatic irony, that this Thane of Cawdor is already turning against him. So he may be too trusting, all right? And that idea of an absolute trust, that's really significant, because it shows that he's built an absolute trust on Macbeth as well, and Macbeth is about to betray him. So we get this feeling that maybe he should have been a bit more cautious, and maybe he should have seen it coming, but he doesn't do that. And this is where the theme of deception starts to creep in, which is fantastic, because you can start to use some of these quotes to illustrate this idea of deception and mistrust and those ideas too. So, as always, let's summarise, because I know this has been quite a short video, but Duncan is relatively small character in terms of how much time he appears in and the relevance of him relating to kingship and so on. So let's have a look at what we need to summarise for this. What do we need to know based on what we've just covered? So how does Duncan show that he's a good king in these scenes? And that largely comes from what he does in terms of the way that he treats the people. Maybe you could think about stagecraft and the way he talks. We do have some punctuation that illustrates some ideas about that. And also think about him promoting certain people and giving them new titles and the way that he does that. And then also look at the language that he uses. So the language he uses to talk about people and talk to people directly, that's a fantastic indication of exactly what sort of a king Duncan is. So as long as you understand those things, how can you see he's a good king from those different elements? That's good in terms of your knowledge. That's the knowledge that we need. Now we need that knowledge to be able to answer this question. So we're going to apply it now to talk about this question. So we've got these big questions, but I also want you to think about information from our previous lessons that we've looked at in these videos, because as we go further and further through the play, it's really important that you don't just apply what you've learned in this one lesson, but we apply it in context to the whole of the lessons, all the different things that start threading through. So, for example, why is it important that Duncan is seen as being a good king? Now, we just talked about that, but you need to reference the great chain of being and expectations of a king in those times. And also you need to think about how an audience reacts when he's murdered then. All right, so think about that. A good king, when he's murdered, we're going to get a different real audience reaction to if a bad king was murdered, as you would expect. Like at the end of the play, when Macbeth is the king and he's murdered, we don't expect the audience's reaction to be the same in that instance. So why is it important that Duncan is seen as being a really good king, both now in the play and later on when he's killed? How does Duncan's trusting nature link to the themes of deception? So look at that last slide, especially that we talked about for Act 1, Scene 4. How does that and the previous Thane of Cawdor and the ideas there link to this nature of deception and the theme of deception? And also think about what Macbeth's thinking internally. So if you go back to lesson 3, when we look at Macbeth's changing attitude towards becoming king, maybe you can use some of that as well, and the idea of of deception, because what Macbeth's saying to Duncan's face is very different to what he's thinking internally. So think about that as well, and the way that deception might rear its head there. Okay, and what we've got there, look, is really important, because those ideas link to kingship, and they also link to themes like deception. All right, and those are key ideas and key elements that, as we go through, these will be the starting point of some of those essays that you may end up writing about those themes. Okay, so next lesson, we're going to look at Lady Macbeth. And we're going to look at the way that she is introduced in the play. But for now, hopefully, you've got some really good annotations from that. And if you haven't annotated your copy, go back, have a look at it. Make sure that you take some of these key quotes down and annotate them, and then have a go at doing these questions. Okay, I'll see you next time for our next video lesson.